The dust of Redemption Creek was a fine, pale powder that settled on everything, a shroud for the living and the dead. It settled on the raw wood of the trading post, on the sweat-slicked backs of the horses at the rail, and on the girl tied to the porch pillar. She wore the dust like a second skin, a map of misery drawn over the grime and bruises. Her feet, bare and cracked, were planted in it. Her hair, a tangled mat of brown, was gilded with it. She did not look at the men who gathered, their boots scuffing patterns in the dirt, their eyes lingering on her like flies on meat. She had learned long ago that looking back gave them a purchase. It made her real, and being real was a dangerous thing. So she fixed her gaze on a loose board in the high plank sidewalk across the street, counting the splintered grains, the rust-wept nails. She made it her whole world. The board did not spit. It did not murmur. It did not have a price. The man who owned the rope around her wrists, a sour-faced mule skinner named Jeb, slapped the pillar beside her head. The crack of it made her flinch, a tiny, inward shudder she hoped no one saw. Right then, Jeb's voice was gravelly impatient, as is, strong back, quiet. Cost me a good mule, this one did. But my wife's sister arrived, so I'm overstocked on womenfolk. A few men chuckled, a low, thick sound. The heat was a heavy blanket. A dog, ribs showing like a washboard, panted in the sliver of shade under the porch. The girl focused on the board. 1, 2, 3 deep cracks running its length. She imagined herself shrinking, becoming small enough to slip inside one of them, to live in the cool, dark space between the fibers of the wood. What's she good for? A voice called out from the small clutch of onlookers. Anything you need a pair of hands for, Jeb said with a greasy smile. And she don't talk back. A blessing, that is. She felt their eyes then, a physical weight. They were assessing her like livestock, judging the strength in her thin arms, the set of her shoulders. She was an object, a tool to be bartered. A silence fell, thick and waiting. No one moved. The price of a mule was steep, even a broken one. The initial interest curdled into indifference. The crowd was a fickle beast. Its hunger had been sated by the spectacle, and now it was growing bored. They started to drift away in ones and twos, turning back to their own dusty concerns. Just as Jeb was about to spit in disgust and haul her back toward whatever hole he kept her in, another silence fell. This one was different. It was not empty. It was held, and it came from the edge of the street, where a man stood alone. He had not been part of the gawking circle. He stood separate, his frame tall but stooped, as if carrying a weight that was not visible. He wore a long, worn duster the color of the road, and his hat was pulled low, shadowing a face carved by sun and sorrow. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He had been watching, not her, but the entire, shabby scene, his gaze missing nothing. Elias Thorne was a man who knew the shape of loss. It was in the set of his jaw, the way he held his hands, the hollow space that surrounded him like a second coat. The town knew him as the widower from out on the barren stretch, the man whose wife, Martha, had been taken by a fever 3 winters back. He kept to himself, coming to town only for what he could not grow, trap, or build. He took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. The few remaining men turned to look at him. Jeb squinted, recognizing him. Thorne. Come for the show. Elias's eyes, the color of a faded sky, moved from Jeb to the girl. For the first time he looked directly at her. She felt it, a look that was not assessing or hungry but measuring. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, like being seen after years of being invisible. She instinctively dropped her gaze back to the safety of the wooden plank. He ignored Jeb's question. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy, like it came from under floorboards. What do you want for the rope? Jeb blinked, confused. The rope? It's a good rope. But the girl comes with it. I know, Elias said. The simple words hung in the air. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet had more force than Jeb's bluster. He reached into a pocket of his duster and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He tipped it and a few coins glinted in his palm. Not much. Less than the price of a lame horse, let alone a good mule. That's all I have on me, Elias said, his eyes still on Jeb. Jeb laughed. A short, ugly bark. That won't buy you a decent meal, Thorne. Let alone. He gestured crudely at the girl. Elias did not flinch. I'll add the rooster I was coming for. And my next 24 eggs. A flicker of calculation crossed Jeb's face. He was about to be left with nothing. The town had lost interest. "What in God's name would you want with her?" he asked, a sneer in his voice. "Getting lonely out on that rock pile of yours." A deep stillness settled over Elias. The air grew tight. He looked past Jeb, his gaze distant, as if speaking to the wind itself. "Foxes," he said, the word flat and final. "Keep getting my chickens. I need someone to watch the coop." The explanation was so plain, so devoid of passion or lust, that it stunned Jeb into silence. It was a reason of the earth. It was practical. It made a strange kind of sense. It stripped the transaction of its leering undertones and turned it into something else entirely. A chore. A necessity. Jeb grunted, weighing the coins in his mind against the trouble of keeping her. He spat into the dust. "Fine. She's your problem now. The chickens likely eat better than she will." Elias stepped onto the porch. He did not hand the coins to Jeb. He placed them carefully on the rail next to a splintered post. A clean exchange. Then he walked to the girl. She tensed, her whole body a knot of fear, expecting a rough hand, a shove. Instead, he simply stood before her. She could smell the scent of clean earth and sweat on him, a smell different from the sour odor of Jeb. He reached into his coat, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was pulling out a whip or a strap. But it was a small, worn pocket knife. He did not speak. With a single, fluid motion, he sawed through the coarse rope binding her wrists to the pillar. The fibers parted. The tension snapped. Her hands fell free into her lap, useless and numb. The blood rushed back into them with 1,000 tiny, painful needles. She cradled them to her chest, her head bowed, hiding her face behind the curtain of her tangled hair. He stepped back, giving her space. He did not touch her. He did not speak her new owner's name. He simply waited. After a long moment, he turned and walked toward a rickety wagon hitched nearby. He did not look back to see if she was following. He trusted the cut rope to be its own command. She remained frozen for a heartbeat, the dust swirling around her bare feet. The pillar felt cold against her back where the rope had been. She could run. The thought was a wild bird fluttering in her chest. But where? Into the vast, indifferent landscape that would swallow her whole? To another town, another Jeb, another rope? She looked at the man's back. It was a straight, solid line against the harsh glare of the sun. He was climbing onto the wagon seat. He had not bought her body. He had bought her labor. He had bought her for the chickens. It was the first time her value had been measured in something that lived and breathed and was not a man's pride. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled. She took one step, then another, following him. The dust lifted behind her like the ghosts of all the footsteps she had ever been forced to take. The journey to his homestead was carved out of silence. The only sounds were the creak and groan of the wagon wheels, the weary plod of the 2 mules, and the vast, sighing whisper of the wind across the plains. The sun beat down, relentless. Elias did not speak. He kept his eyes on the horizon, a faint, bruised line of hills that never seemed to get any closer. She sat in the back of the wagon, huddled against a sack of flour, making herself as small as possible. The movement was jarring, each rut in the track sending a jolt through her tired bones. She watched him, the straight line of his back, the way his hands held the reins with a steady, practiced ease. He was a part of this landscape, weathered and unyielding. After an hour, the heat grew thick in her throat. Her tongue felt swollen. He must have sensed her distress without turning around. He reached for a canteen beside him on the seat, uncorked it, and held it back over his shoulder. He did not look at her. His arm simply remained there, an offering suspended in the silent air. She hesitated. Kindness was a currency she did not trust. It always came with a hidden cost. But the thirst was a fire in her belly. Slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the heavy canteen. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever known. She drank, not greedily, but in small, careful sips, and handed it back. His fingers closed around it, and the transaction was complete. Not a word was spoken. It was the first kindness. They arrived as dusk was bleeding across the sky in shades of blood orange and violet. The homestead was just as she had imagined it would be from looking at him. It was a small, solid house made of sod and weathered timber, crouched low against the earth as if for protection. A barn, listing slightly to one side, stood nearby. A few chickens scratched nervously in a fenced-in run. The place did not feel like a home. It felt like a shelter. It felt haunted. To the east of the house, on a small rise, was a single, stark wooden cross. A small pile of stones, neatly arranged, marked the grave. Even from a distance, she could see it was free of weeds. The earth around it was tended. This was Martha's place. The air around it felt thin and sacred. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. His movements were stiff with exhaustion. He unhitched the mules, leading them to a trough, his actions economical and precise. He did not tell her what to do. He left her to exist in the space he had brought her to. She slid from the back of the wagon, her bare feet sinking into the cool, dark earth. It was softer than the dust of the town. The house stood before her, its 2 windows like vacant eyes. It was breathing, she thought, a slow, shallow breath of sorrow. He finished with the mules and walked toward the house, his boots heavy on the packed dirt. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, leaving it open behind him. It was not an invitation, but a simple fact. This was the entrance. She followed him into the gloom. The inside of the house was one large room, spare and brutally clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a patched quilt, occupied a corner. There was a smell of wood smoke, old sorrow, and soap. Elias moved to the hearth, striking a match. The flare of it threw his shadow, huge and distorted, against the wall. Fire caught the kindling, and a small, hungry light began to push back the darkness. He straightened up and turned to her. In the flickering firelight, the lines on his face were canyons. He gestured with his chin toward a small alcove near the door, separated from the main room by a hanging blanket. There, he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her directly since the road. She peeked behind the blanket. It was a small space, barely big enough for the narrow cot and the small crate that served as a table. But it was separate. It was hers. He then pointed to the main table. On it he had placed a heel of bread and a tin cup of water. It was a silent statement. Here is food. Here is drink. You are provided for. He did not watch her eat. He turned his back, busying himself with some task by the fire, granting her the dignity of privacy. She ate the bread slowly, making it last. It was stale, but it filled the aching hollowness in her stomach. When she was done, she saw him looking at the main door. I don't lock doors, he said, his voice low. He was not looking at her, but at the dark rectangle of the night outside. No need. Nothing out here to get you that ain't already inside. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement of fact about the world they lived in. But for her, a girl who had known only bolts and bars, the words landed like a pardon. He would not trap her. The choice to stay or go, however impossible, was hers. This was the unspoken contract. She had a space, she had food, and she was not a prisoner. In return, she owed him the chickens. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a slow pulse. Life was measured by the rising and setting of the sun, by the needs of the animals, by the turning of the earth. They worked. It was the only language they shared, a vocabulary of silent, parallel action. Elias would rise before the sun had fully breached the horizon, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm. He would move about the main room, stoking the fire, his movements quiet and contained. He never entered her small alcove. The hanging blanket was a border he never crossed. By the time she emerged, he would be gone, out to the barn or the fields, a solitary figure moving against the vast, empty canvas of the prairie. Her domain was the house and the chicken coop. The first few days, she moved like a ghost, a whisper of movement in the quiet rooms. She swept the floorboards until they were pale and smooth. She scrubbed the single pot and the 2 tin plates until they shone. The work was an anchor, something to hold onto in the vast sea of silence. The chickens became her charges. They were skittish, loud, and stupid, but they were alive. She learned their frantic, clucking language. She gathered their eggs, still warm, in a small basket, placing them on the table for him to find. She secured the latch on the coop each night, her eyes scanning the darkening fields for the glint of a predator's eye. She was earning her keep. They rarely spoke. Words felt like stones thrown into a still pond, a disruption of the fragile peace they had built. Their communication was a thing of gesture and observation. One morning, she found a pair of worn leather shoes by her cot. They were too big, stuffed with rags to fit, but they were shoes. Her feet, raw and blistered, accepted the gift without question. She never thanked him. He never acknowledged giving them. The shoes were simply there, a fact. Another day, while drawing water, the rope on the bucket frayed and snapped. She stood staring at the useless cord, a familiar knot of despair tightening in her chest. Later that afternoon, he came from the barn with a new rope, thick and strong. He spent an hour rethreading the pulley, his large, calloused hands working with a surprising gentleness. He did not speak to her as he worked, but she stood nearby and watched, and when he was done, he simply nodded once and walked away. Slowly, cautiously, she began to bring life back into the hollow house. She found a patch of stubborn wildflowers growing near the creek and picked a small handful. She put them in an old tin cup and set them on the table. When Elias came in that evening, he stopped and looked at the small burst of color. He did not say anything, but he moved the cup to the center of the table, a small act of acceptance. One afternoon, a sharp wind blew up from the north, carrying the first real chill of autumn. She saw it whip across the small, tended grave on the hill, scattering the dried leaves she had seen him painstakingly clear away just days before. On impulse, she walked up the rise. The wooden cross was gray and weathered, the name Martha carved into it with careful, loving strokes. She knelt in the dirt, her borrowed shoes pressing into the soil, and began to sweep the new leaves away with her bare hands. She tidied the stones. It was an intrusion, a trespass on his private grief, but it felt necessary. It felt right. He must have seen her from the field. That evening, the silence at the table felt different. It was less empty, more full. He pushed a bowl of stew toward her, thicker and with more meat than usual. Their eyes met across the table for a brief second, a flicker of understanding that passed between them without a sound. The nights were the hardest. The wind howled around the small house, a lonely, mournful sound. Sometimes, she would wake from dreams of ropes and angry voices, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. One night, a thunderstorm broke over the plains with a terrible violence. Lightning split the sky, and thunder cracked like the world was breaking apart. A bolt struck somewhere close, the sound so loud it shook the very foundations of the house. A small, choked cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. She sat bolt upright on her cot, trembling, her hands covering her ears. The blanket to her alcove was pulled aside. Elias stood there, a silhouette against the fire's low glow. He held an old, heavy shawl. "Just the sky making noise," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm. He did not come closer. He simply held out the shawl. She stared at him, her fear warring with her caution. After a long moment, she crept forward and took it from his hand. It was heavy wool, and it smelled of him, of wood smoke and earth. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The weight of it was grounding, a solid presence in the chaos. He nodded once, then went back to his chair by the fire. He did not go back to bed. He sat there, staring into the flames, a silent guardian, until the storm passed and the first gray light of dawn touched the windows. She sat on her cot, wrapped in his shawl, and watched his back. For the first time since she could remember, she did not feel entirely alone in the dark. That night something shifted. A foundation of trust, laid stone by silent stone, finally settled into place. The first time she tried to bake bread, the result was a small, dense brick that could have stunned a coyote. She placed it on the table between them, a lump of failure. Elias picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and rapped his knuckles against the crust. It made a hollow, solid sound. He looked at her, and the corners of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice dry as dust. She felt a flush of shame, but then he took his knife, sawed off a piece with considerable effort, and put it in his mouth. He chewed for a long, thoughtful moment. "A little dry," he finally pronounced. "You didn't complain about mine," a new voice said. It was thin and rusty from disuse. "Her own." Elias froze, the bread halfway to his mouth. He looked at her as if she had just grown a second head. She stared back, horrified at her own audacity. The words had just come out. A long silence stretched between them. Then he slowly lowered the piece of bread. He looked at the loaf, then back at her. A genuine smile, small and crooked, finally broke through the sorrow on his face. It transformed him. "No," he said softly. "I did not." That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, she dared to ask the question that had been sitting in her heart for months. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" He knew what she meant. Why her? Why that day? He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames dancing in his tired eyes. "My Martha," he began, his voice thick with memory. "She was a kind woman. She couldn't abide cruelty to any living thing. Not a dog, not a field mouse. Not a person," he paused, swallowing hard. "When I saw you there, tied to that post, it felt like I was letting her down, letting the whole world down, if I just walked away. It was not right." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and clear. It was just not right. She understood. He had not saved her for himself. He had saved her for the memory of a woman she would never know. He had done it because his own broken heart still remembered how to be good. Wrapped in the quiet of the small house, surrounded by the vast and lonely plains, she finally felt something other than fear. It was a fragile feeling, thin as a spider's thread, but it felt astonishingly like hope. The piece they had so carefully stitched together with raw thread was fragile. They both knew it. It was a shelter built of quiet days and unspoken kindness, but the world outside was still full of men like Jeb. The past had a long shadow, and one afternoon in late autumn that shadow fell across their land. Elias was mending a fence line at the far edge of his property when he saw it, a lone rider silhouetted against the pale afternoon sun, moving steadily toward the homestead. It was not the gait of a neighbor or a lost traveler. There was an arrogance in the posture, a purposefulness that set a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. He left his tools where they lay and walked back toward the house, his stride long and urgent. She was outside, scattering feed for the chickens, the birds clucking and jostling around her feet. She had been humming, a small, tuneless sound of contentment. She saw him coming from the field, saw the grim set of his jaw, and the hum died in her throat. She followed his gaze back to the rider, who was now close enough to be identified. It was Silas, the man who had sold her brother, though she hadn't known his name then. He was the one who had brought her to Redemption Creek. His face a mask of false piety as he'd handed her rope over to Jeb. He had claimed her family owed him a debt. She had been the payment. Seeing him now, riding toward this small sanctuary, felt like a violation. All the old fear, the cold, helpless dread she thought she had buried, came rushing back, clung to her like wet paper. Elias reached the porch just as Silas rode into the yard, reining his horse in with a flourish that kicked up a cloud of dust. He dismounted, his boots loud on the packed earth, a smirk playing on his lips. He was a portly man with small, shrewd eyes that took in everything. The repaired barn, the healthy chickens, the girl standing frozen by the coop. His eyes lingered on her. She was no longer the starved, filthy creature he had discarded. Her hair was clean, tied back with a piece of string. She wore shoes. She looked settled. "Thorn," Silas said, his voice oozing a false heartiness. "Heard you'd taken on a stray. Didn't realize it was my stray." Elias moved to stand on the top step of the porch, placing himself between Silas and the house. He did not invite the man to stay. He did not offer a greeting. He just stood there, a silent, immovable obstacle. "She's not a stray," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's not yours." Silas chuckled, patting the dust from his waistcoat. "Now, there's where you're mistaken. There was a misunderstanding, you see. A family matter. She was never meant for public sale. That Jeb, he overstepped. I've come to collect what's mine." His argument was based on a lie, a claim of ownership he had forfeited months ago. He saw her not as a person, but as a recovered asset, now more valuable than before. "She was sold," Elias stated, his voice flat. "The transaction is done." "A paltry sum for a damaged good," Silas sneered, his gaze flicking to her again. "I'm prepared to be generous. I'll repay your expenses. And you can go back to your lonely life, old man." The air grew thick with menace. This was not a negotiation. It was a demand. The homestead, once a place of quiet refuge, had become a battleground. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves on the single cottonwood tree, the sound like a rising whisper of warning. She stood by the coop, her hands clenched into fists, the familiar feeling of being a piece of property, a thing to be argued over, threatening to swallow her whole. But this time was different. This time she was not tied to a post. And she was not alone. "She is not property," Elias said, and the words were not a plea, but a declaration. He descended the single step from the porch, planting his feet firmly in the dirt of the yard. He was not a big man, not a brawler, but at that moment he seemed to take root in the earth, as immovable as an ancient stone. "She has a place here. You will leave." Silas's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. He had expected a weary old man, easily intimidated. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding wall of conviction. "I have papers," he lied, gesturing vaguely toward his saddlebag. "A contract of indenture from her family. Signed and sealed. The law is on my side." "There is no law out here but what is right," Elias answered, his voice low and steady. "And you, sir, are on the wrong side of it." Silas lost his patience. The pretense of civility dropped away, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. "Enough of this," he snarled, taking a step toward her. "Girl, come here." It was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when a man's will would be imposed upon her. Her body remembered this feeling. It wanted to shrink, to obey, to cower. But then she looked at Elias. He stood between her and the threat, a lone guardian on the windswept plain. He had not bought her for his pleasure or his pride. He had bought her for the chickens. He had given her shoes. He had sat with her through a storm. He had seen her as a person when she had forgotten how to be one herself. Something inside her, a small, hard kernel of defiance that had survived all the years of silence, finally broke open. As Silas reached for her, she did not scream. She did not run. She acted. Her eyes darted around the yard, landing on the heavy, cast-iron skillet she had left by the outdoor washing basin. It was black and solid. In one fluid motion, she lunged for it, her hand closing around the familiar weight of its handle. She lifted it, holding it like a shield, its heft a surprising comfort in her hand. Silas stopped dead, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had expected tears, not iron. Then she spoke. The voice that came out was not the thin, rusty whisper he had heard before. It was clear and it was cold. No! The word, a single syllable of refusal, hung in the air, sharp as a shard of glass. It was the first time she had ever said it to a man like him. It was the sound of a lock breaking. It was the sound of her own soul reclaiming its territory. Elias did not look at her, but he heard. A flicker of something, pride, perhaps, crossed his face. He stood a little taller. Silas, a bully at his core, was unnerved. He was accustomed to power over the powerless. A man who would not back down and a woman holding an iron skillet was a combination he had not prepared for. He wavered, his bluster failing him. It was at that moment that the sound of another wagon reached them, rattling down the track. Mr. Henderson, their closest neighbor from 5 miles east, pulled his team to a halt at the edge of the yard. He was a stern, watchful man who had observed the strange pairing at the Thorn place with quiet curiosity. He had seen the tended grave, the smoke rising steadily from the chimney, the woman working in the yard. He had seen the slow return of life to a place that had been dying. He took in the scene, Silas, red-faced and angry, Elias, calm and resolute, the girl, fierce and armed with a frying pan. Henderson didn't say a word. He just sat on his wagon seat, holding his shotgun loosely across his lap, and watched. His presence, silent and judging, was enough. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Silas was no longer confronting an isolated old man and a broken girl. He was facing a community, however small. He looked from Elias's stony face to the woman's defiant one, to the silent neighbor with the shotgun. He was outnumbered by a force he could not comprehend. With a curse, he backed away, his bravado collapsing into sullen defeat. He scrambled onto his horse, yanked the reins with a vicious tug, and galloped away, leaving behind nothing but a trail of dust and impotent rage. Silence descended on the yard, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow and the nervous clucking of the chickens. The threat was gone. She stood there, the skillet still held aloft, her arm trembling from the weight and the adrenaline. Elias turned to her. His face was filled with a profound, quiet emotion. He walked to her and gently, so gently, took the heavy skillet from her grasp. His fingers brushed against hers. He set it down on the porch step. "I was scared," she whispered, the admission a crack in her new armor. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the last of the winter finally melt from his. "I know," he said softly. "You didn't run." He had not said, "You were brave," he had said, "You didn't run." It was a more meaningful truth. She had stood her ground. On this small patch of earth she had chosen to stay. In the days that followed the confrontation, the silence in the house changed again. It was no longer a space between two solitudes, but a shared quiet, comfortable and deep. The unspoken contract of labor and shelter had been fulfilled and then broken open, replaced by something stronger, forged in the heat of a shared defense. They had stood together. They had become a we. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he turned to her, his expression serious. "He called you girl? Everyone calls you girl. That's not a name." He paused, his gaze steady. "What is your name?" It was a question no one had asked her in years. A name was a claim to self, a thing that could be taken away. She had packed hers down deep inside where no one could touch it. To speak it now felt like an act of profound trust, like handing over the key to the last locked room in her soul. Lena, she said, the name feeling strange and new on her tongue. Lena, he repeated, testing the sound of it in the quiet room. It's a good name. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down her past with an iron skillet, the woman who put wildflowers on his wife's grave, the woman who had brought the faintest echo of a song back into his silent house. Lena, he said again, this time with a deep finality. A man shouldn't be alone. A woman shouldn't be alone. He took a deep breath. This house needs a wife. And my chickens, they need a mother. A tiny smile touched her lips at his stubborn pragmatism. It was his way. And does this wife have a husband? She asked, her voice steady. He's asking her, Elias said, his eyes full of a quiet, hopeful light. They were married by a traveling preacher a month later, with Mr. Henderson and his wife as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony held in the yard under the vast blue sky. Lena wore a plain dress she had sewn herself, and in her hair she tucked one of the stubborn wildflowers from the creek. That afternoon they did not celebrate with a feast or a party. Instead, they performed a ritual of their own. Lena took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one she had kept bundled in the bottom of a crate. It was the last remnant of the girl who was tied to a post, the girl with no name. Together, they walked to the fire pit and she tossed it into the flames. They stood side by side and watched it burn, the foul smoke rising up into the clean prairie air until it was nothing but ash. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The next spring, Elias dug a new post hole beside the fence near the house. He and Lena planted a small sapling, a young cottonwood, not far from the grave on the hill. It was a promise to the future, its roots reaching down into the same earth that held his past. It was a testament that life and loss could and must exist together. The house, once a hollow shell of grief, began to breathe again. Laughter, quiet at first, then more frequent, echoed off its timber walls. The scent of baking bread, good bread, now filled the air. The single room felt not spare, but full. Full of a shared life, stitched together one silent, patient gesture at a time. The final image of them was not one of passion, but one of deep, abiding peace. They sat together on the porch steps as the sun went down, casting long shadows across the land they now shared. Elias was whittling a small bird from a piece of scrap wood. Lena was mending one of his shirts, her needle moving in a steady, rhythmic pattern. A child, a boy with Elias's quiet eyes and Lena's resilient spirit, slept soundly in a cradle just inside the open door. The silence between them was not empty. It was a language. It was home. He reached out not for her, but for the sleeping child, his large, rough hand resting gently on the cradle's edge, a silent promise of protection. She looked at him, and her smile was a quiet dawn. They had not found a fairy tale. They had found something far more real. They had taken the broken pieces of two separate lives and built a fortress. This story, it is not just about a rescue. It is about the quiet courage it takes to claim a life and to grant one to another. It is about the difference between a price and a value. One is what a thing costs. The other is what it is worth. The world is full of people who will try to tell you your price. They will tie you to a post in the public square of their judgment and list your flaws and your faults. But your value, that is a different ledger. It is not written in coin or contract. It is written in quiet acts of defiance. In the wildflower placed in a cup. In the skillet raised against a bully. In the courage to stand your ground when every instinct tells you to run. It is the moment you answer the question, what is your name? So here is your naming. In the dust of your own redemption creek, remember that your worth is not in being unbroken, but in the fierce and stubborn way you have survived the breaking. And if you are very brave and very lucky, you might find someone who doesn't see your scars as damage, but as the map of where you have been and is willing to walk the road with you to wherever you are going. You might find someone who will stand with you, not because they own you, but because your fight has become their own. And in that shared silence, you might just build a home.